What's up, World Wide Web? Welcome to my first Death Battle review, and what better way to start than with Dante vs Clive. As I certainly expressed in my reaction video, I was very pleased with how the episode turned out overall. However, there were a couple of off elements that I noticed that did catch my attention. Thus, it got me curious about how well this video generally would hold up. So for this review, I thought it'd be best to analyze the video in three specific areas: the fight animation, the score or the versus track, and the writing. The writing is going to be covered last because there's so much to cover there. Let's begin by covering the fight animation, and I gotta say, Tori and the animation team did a spectacular job with this episode. I mean, the fight is so epic, there's so many great shots, it all looks so smooth, and, you know, there were so many successful elements that I just gotta say the viewer is definitely going to leave this video with their satisfaction quenched. Although, when I first watched the video, there were definitely a few things that I thought were off. They weren't too big or buggy to detract from my enjoyment of the video, but they were just slightly peculiar things that, you know, that really did catch my attention. To get a better picture of what I mean, let's take a quick look at the character models. Dante, he looks very suave as he usually does. As for Clive, I mean, he looks pretty good, and good God, what are those eyes? It may just be how the lighting works, or how the model is incorporated into whatever animation program they have going on over there, but Clive just kind of looks like he got an eye transplant from a Gmod character. I mean, just take a look at those peepers. Those eyes are definitely wild, but at least there aren't a lot of frames that close in or give us a close-up of Clive's face like that. And thankfully, Clive does look better powered up because he gains that lovely blue iris or whatever part of the eye that is. So thank God for that. Another small thing I noticed is during the duel between Clive's Odin powers and Dante's Devil Trigger. Now, this sequence is very cool overall. It's very reminiscent of Dante's fight against Virgil in the raid, as their blinds are just slicing through the particles during their exchange. This duel is just so cool, and the progression is just adding to Clive's universe. That says Zon Tesuken. Oops, it looks like a typo may have snuck past and got into the final cut. Now, to be clear, this isn't a criticism. I just think one letter off typos are pretty funny. The iconic attack featured in Final Fantasy is spelled Zantetsuken and pronounced as Zantetsuken for a general Western audience. The name being Japanese in origin, and at face value, I would translate it as Rending Iron Blade from my many exposures to anime and JRPGs in general. Whereas the Final Fantasy wiki translates it as Iron Cutting Sword. Kind of the same vein. It's just kind of depends on how you interpret what Zon means. If only I understood my kanji though, and didn't really just go on my general knowledge, maybe I'd really understand that better. But this is a fun time to share with y'all that I graduated with a minor degree in Japanese. So there's that little fun segment for you. Anyways, typos aside, this sequence is still fun to watch. So, after going over these slightly minor things, you'd think I'd have no issues with the fight overall. Sadly, I wish that were true. The main thing I have trouble getting past from this fight animation are with some of the transitions. As epic as this fight truly is, it isn't totally smooth from start to finish. The first instance that comes to my mind is how we get to Dante's pole dancing scene. You know, the one featured at in the fight preview at the start of the video. Dante's having a good time using the electric guitar and sends a swarm of electric bats towards Clive's direction. Clive's response is to slide in with Shiva's ice powers, closing in as a flash transition appears and reveals that Clive is just standing there as Dante kicks him in the face. Yeah, first seeing this, it confused me on how exactly they got there. There wasn't anything to show Dante countering Shiva's power in general. Just a rough scene change to a different fight animation. Kinda reminds me of someone just getting started on editing videos, and they just learned about the free transitions that come with their editing software. The other transition I find kind of questionable is how the fighters returned to the planet's surface in the first place, especially considering they were fighting in space. I gotta start off by saying that the clash between the Free Risen and Sin Devil Trigger is insanely epic. Like, Goku vs. Superman 2023 levels of awesomeness. And maybe it's precisely because of how intensely epic it is that might make it difficult to follow up on. During the clash of their final forms, it looks like Dante is preparing to charge out of Free with his blade, as Clive prepares the Hellfire, or what was aptly named the Fire Spirit Bomb. It looks like the fighters have some fair distance between them, and Dante is preparing what I assume is Judgment, as a Free launches Hellfire. The smoke and sexy collision is cool and all, but did Clive really end up returning to the planet that way? The way the interaction is portrayed, I think that Clive would send Dante back to the surface via Hellfire, even if the portrayal justifies the explosion. I think that the two fighters would be sent in different directions rather than going down to the same place together, especially with how they ended up back where they started, together, after falling from space. For me, this feels like a Deku vs. Asa situation, where you question where one fighter ends up after a giant explosion or impact. It's kind of funny, since that episode makes you question how Deku is still up in the air, and here I'm questioning how exactly in hell Clive ended up down on the ground. Maybe the interaction would make more sense if I played Devil May Cry 5. Now, those are the only obvious transitions that really stood out to me. Other transition concerns were more blink and you'll miss it moments. These include the Mega Flare Clive fired horizontally, yet pushed back Dante at an angle into the Mother Crystal, and the jump Dante made from coughing up blood to sucker punching Dante with Rebellion. So, with these factors in consideration, I would have to rate the overall fight animation at a 94 for a solid A. The errors and issues are noticeable, but it's not strong enough to detract from from what the animation team accomplished with this showcase. The fight dynamics were all well polished, the environment responded well to the fighters, and the character models transcendentally perform above what the show achieved in its earlier seasons. This fight clearly had a lot of ambition, and it clearly shows off if you look at all the individual scenes. I love when creators in general have high motivations for their projects, and the passion they dedicate towards it is palpable to the audience. Dante vs. Clive is easily the most enjoyable 3D fight in Death Battle's independent era so far, and what I believe to be Torian's Goku vs. Superman 2023 in a sense. So as I stated before in my reaction video, props to all the animators that worked on this fight. It's going to hold up well for years to come. Now, with the discussion of the fight out of the way, we need to talk about the musical score that accompanied it. I had a feeling that Brandon Yates would be in charge of this fight track once I found out that Thurl Media was in charge of Blade vs. Buffy, and Yates delivered once again in that rock metal music genre style that he's known to provide. This time, however, I'm a bit conflicted about how I should feel about it. For Dante vs. Clive, Yates gives us the track The Devil Inside, a name well suited for Dante and the Devil May Cry series. Yet, to me, it doesn't quite feel like it fits just as well for Clive. I get how we can tie into Clive's inner demons of losing his home, brother, and various comrades along the way, but referring to Ifrit as a demon is a little bit of a stretch for me. So, the title itself is a pass, but it doesn't immediately hit Clive's notes for me. As for the music itself, this evaluation called for listening to how it played both individually and during the fight. Right off the bat, Yates pulled off his strengths well when it came to the rock and metal segments that represented Dante. What came off as a surprise was the incorporation of other string instruments like violins to match the symphonic pieces that come from Final Fantasy XVI. When listening from start to finish, there are great transitions between the two sides representing our fighters for this episode. Except, is this track a balanced representation for both fighters? Unfortunately for me, I don't feel like it is. Listening to this track all the way through, it's very easy to identify Dante's musical motifs, and at times, it kinda overpowers the elements that Clive is supposed to have. This is especially the case when playing this during the fight, and the more hype moments happen when there's a stronger instance of Dante's playing. It's almost like a Batman vs. Iron Man situation, because one tone, or the overall tone, is very Dante coded, except it isn't because of, well, the ending. Delegating Clive's representation to orchestral strings and the one choir segment probably wasn't as successful, and it's a bit disappointing that Clive's representation is limited to such. Go take a listen to Final Fantasy XVI's Find the Flame or any Final Fantasy XIV track by Masayoshi Soken, and you might understand why I'd like to have a little more on Clive's part. Hey there, this is Future Darkly. I forgot to mention something about the lyrics, and basically I think it's just a good blended adaptation or representation of both characters. I do feel like this lyrics also give off more Dante vibes, especially when looking a little bit closer at the language of the words. That's it. Alright, back to the review. Punk rock, post-hardcore, or metal screams are all part of the music genre that I love to listen to. But I'm unsure if the screams are enough to fill the void of the orchestral choir in Find the Flame. So because of the unbalanced representation, I'd have to give this track an 88 or a B+. It's a great track in of itself, yet Clive's representation isn't as obvious when the fight plays and gets overpowered by the other musical elements of the track. So now it's finally time to cover the big bulk of the episode, the writing. We're going to try to cover the analysis for both characters as well as the verdict as quickly as we can, while also throwing in a little sprinkle of how the writing may have impacted or translated into the overall portrayal of the fight. Luckily for us, Dante's analysis has it easier off. Since Dante vs. Bayonetta already exists, there's a clear reference to build off of and revise for an improved version. And luckily, I'd say they achieved that because the editing and the writing worked so well in tandem, and it gave us a fun little analysis that really befits who Dante is as a character. He's hardcore, but he's still got a fun personality, and his analysis gives us a good general gist of his story that transitions well into exploring what makes him the remarkable fighter that he is. It even does a good job of incorporating data from Devil May Cry 5, all new material since Dante vs. Bayonetta first aired. And it sizes up Dante into a new visualization or concept of the Dante that we got for this death. This segment was a fun little journey and nails summarizing Dante in a pretty little package. As for Clive's analysis, it should also be known as Final Fantasy XVI in about 6.5 minutes. Yeah, I did the math for that. So it's basically a summary of Final Fantasy XVI, but then again, Clive is essentially the focal point of the game, so it checks out. Although, this can both be a good and a bad thing. The writing examines Final Fantasy XVI from start to finish, and probably covers the feats Dante collected along the way. Though bits of the story are mentioned, they are a little overlooked at times to see how Clive evolved. Clive's role as the liberator of his world all kicked off with Sid, and was fully realized after his death. The analysis refers to Sid only in name, and links him to Ramuh, portraying Clive's role as a liberator as solely something that he owned. To make clear, something specifically that Clive owned, as if he had it from the start. He didn't, though. This may just be a downside to the cool fight factor approach, but there is only so much to include for a character's debut in Deathbound, especially if that game is packed with a lot of lore and a lot of stuff like Final Fantasy. And I can only imagine how they're going to compile over 1,000 episodes of anime information for Ash Ketchum in the next one. If anything, the overlooked story aspects could always be revisited should Clive return for a future episode. I will say, the one thing I never expected this episode was for them to cover time-altering powers in Final Fantasy XVI. I never really thought about it when I first played the game, but they really dug and outright brought these up. Maybe as a means for people questioning what Clive could possibly do about Quicksilver? Well, they definitely showed it to us, although I'm not too sure about justifying a precision dodge as a counter to Quicksilver. I mean, I do know one game that can dodge time stops though. On that note, we should look at the writing for the rest of the video. The post-fight analysis examined the areas of stats, abilities, and endurance. In reviewing the first two sections, there's a balanced coverage that looks at the pros and cons of both of the fighters. Stats seems reasonable, though abilities might be a bit more difficult to sell because of the focus on Clive's alleged time-stopping abilities in Shiva and Odin. The only instance of this that was shown was when Clive was wielding Odin's power and dodged Quicksilver's slowdown of time. To me, this feels a bit janky, and Clive's sell on time control would be more sellable or more believable if we saw Shiva's Diamond Dust in action. Now, let's look at how Endurance got Clive the W. Remember how I said Dante had more of a presence during the fight track? Well, the same thing can kind of be said here. Clive and Ifrit get mentioned what feels like only one time, while Dante gets talked about so much. They really honed in on how Dante's demon powers have a limit in the games and go out of their way to show visual proof. There is no other mention of Clive's endurance because things kind of get pointed back to Ifrit. Now, I've never played a single Devil May Cry, and I question how a demon hunter with at least a decade of experience has less endurance than Clive Rossfield, who has been using Ifrit's powers for at least 5 years. That's the difficult thing with persuasion, or just trying to sell people on your big ideas. You need other supporting angles to really nail your verdict. The analysis really weighs down Dante, while Clive exists with Ifrit and the power of friendship. Oh yeah, they also did mention logos there at the end, but that I still find I need more. With that being said, I would have liked a better picture painted of how Clive takes endurance, especially since the ending recreated the killing flow of Final Fantasy XVI. So while we were able to reach their conclusion, the imbalance of coverage between characters and the deciding factor is making it difficult to nail the landing. I mean, how is base Clive really going to out-endure Dante? I've still got a lot of questions, and I'm not really sold on this verdict, even as a fan of Final Fantasy XVI. Now, I have to give the writing of this episode an 88% for another B+. Most of the info covered for both characters is pretty spot on and depicts them in a very accurate manner, but not all paintings are perfect from start to finish. Even as a fan of Final Fantasy XVI, I found the verdict to be a difficult sell, as I said before. What exactly do the scenarios where Clive showcases better endurance look like? How many of them are Ifrit-based, and how many of them are Logos-based? Was there ever a situation where Clive was knocked out of his Ifrit form by Dante, like Barnabas and Ultima are capable of doing? What does a scenario where Clive faces the Sin Devil Trigger look like? As in, base Clive, no Ifrit, just Clive by himself. With those being said, you can probably tell how I'm not sold on the verdict, especially when we've only just received a named reference to Ifrit or Logos. Aside from the reasoning behind the deciding factor, my only other issue is that their depiction of Clive didn't really fit the supposed time warrior they found him to be. It certainly fits a basic understanding of Clive, but maybe the visualization process got misaligned somewhere down the line. However, as I said during the fight animation segment, the misses aren't big enough to really detract from enjoying the episode. The editing was on point, and I had fun uncovering new aspects of these characters that I didn't really know before. This episode's writing had the bulk of what was probably necessary, and most of it was successfully incorporated in the fight itself. For most viewers, they'd probably recognize this as a successful episode, and it delivered on an epic battle that was a feast for their eyes. But that being said, if we average out all the scores from the 3 covered sections, this episode stands at a good A-. It's only the finer details that held the episode back for me, but it was successful in many other ways. The animated fight scenes are spectacular, the fight track still has a great jam, and the writing holds a good focus on the characters as well as their powers. We should all thank Torian for putting this idea forward for an episode. It's one hell of a banger to help end the year on, and maybe, just maybe, Clive can return to a future episode of Death Battle and maybe possibly fight out. Anyways, that's it for my first ever Death Battle review, or review of any kind. If you viewers enjoyed it, then maybe I'll consider doing another one in the future. Ash vs. Yugi will most likely be a regular reaction, and I'm looking forward to what we might have in store there. So, that's all for me, so I bid you all a smiley rest of your day. Until next time, peace.